Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome to Dave's Spooky Stories. Tonight we'll be featuring fishing stories. Please like and subscribe and let me know in the comments below what you'd like to have for topics in the future. Story number 1, 3 shots. The old cutlass groaned as I pulled it off the gravel road and onto the narrow, overgrown trail leading toward Pine Creek. Dust clung to the rearview mirror, hazing over my reflection. I rolled down the windows, letting in the earthy, pine-scented air. A cigarette dangled between my fingers, the smoke curling out the window and vanishing into the thick woods. This was the kind of night Hemingway would have written about, I thought. A night for trout streams and the kind of quiet that lets you hear yourself think. The cabin sat where it always did, low and weathered, tucked between the trees like a secret. I parked the cutlass, hauled out my pack, and locked the doors out of habit, even though no one but the occasional Amish farmer came out this far. The sun hung low now, casting streaks of orange light through the trees. The stream's soft gurgling was already calling to me. The trail ran parallel to the creek, its edges fringed with ferns and moss. The stream itself tumbled along a bed of smooth stones, shallow in places and deep in others, its surface glinting in the fading light. The air felt alive, cooler by the water, scented with deep earth and wildflowers. I hadn't seen a soul since leaving the highway hours ago, and the stillness felt like a gift. This was my world now, the woods, the water, the sky. About a mile downstream from the cabin, I stripped off my clothes and waded into the creek, the cold shock of it stealing my breath. The water wrapped around me like silk, flowing smooth and steady. I ducked under, letting it close over my head, and when I broke the surface, the world felt sharper, clearer. I imagined Nick Adams doing the same somewhere in Michigan, shaking drops of water from his hair and thinking about fish and stars and the weight of living. When the chill began to bite, I climbed out, dried off with my shirt, and dressed again. The campsite I'd chosen was just up the bank, a flat patch of ground sheltered by an old oak. I pitched the small canvas tent I'd brought, tied the guy lines tight, and built a fire with wood I gathered from the forest floor. As the flames grew, I pulled out a can of beans and set it near the edge of the fire, using my knife to peel back the lid. The first stars winked out as the sun disappeared entirely. I leaned back on my elbows, smoking a cigarette, watching the embers drift up to meet the constellations. For a while I felt like Nick Adams, connected to something timeless, something that couldn't be found in the hum of streetlights or the static buzz of small-town life. When the fire burned down to the glowing coals, I crawled into the tent and sit myself inside. The woods were alive with sound now. Crickets, the rush of the creek, and somewhere in the distance the low, mournful hoot of a great horned owl. I clicked off my flashlight and lay still, letting the dark settle around me. The first prick of unease came when the owl's call stopped. The crickets fell silent too, as if someone had thrown a switch. The only sound left was the creek, its gurgling suddenly sharper, more insistent. I listened, straining to hear anything else, but the silence pressed against my ears like cotton. I told myself it was nothing, just the forest being itself. But the longer I lay there, the more the stillness wrapped around me, heavy and suffocating. I reached for the flashlight, but hesitated. The light would pierce the dark, but it would also make me visible, exposed. Somewhere outside the tent, I thought I heard movement. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like the shifting of leaves underfoot. My pulse quickened, and I gripped my fishing rod, the closest thing I had to a weapon. My mind flickered to Hemingway again, not the Nick Adams who watched trout rise to his fly in the morning sun, but the young boy in 3 Shots, lying in the dark, paralyzed by fear, his gun clutched tightly in his hands. I felt foolish for thinking of it, but the fear was real now, clawing at the edges of my thoughts. I wanted to laugh, to shake it off, but the sound died in my throat. I lay there, staring into the blackness, gripping my fishing rod, as though it might save me from whatever was, or wasn't, out there. The night stretched on. At some point, the owl began calling again, its low hoot cutting through the quiet. The crickets followed, their chorus hesitant at first, then steady. The forest seemed to exhale, the tension easing just long enough for me to close my eyes. When I woke, the tent was warm with morning light. The sounds of the forest were soft and familiar again. Birdsong, the rustle of leaves, the creek's endless chatter. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, half expecting to find some evidence of the night's terror. Footprints, a claw mark, something. But the ground was undisturbed, the fire pit cold and empty. I laughed out loud, the sound bouncing off the trees. I felt silly, embarrassed even, for letting my imagination get the better of me. I packed up slowly, savoring the morning air. As I slung my pack over my shoulder and headed back toward the cabin, I lit another cigarette and thought of Nick Adams again. Not the boy from 3 Shots, but the man he became, the one who knew the woods as both a refuge and a reminder of his own frailty. By the time I reached the cutlass, the fear had faded, leaving only the memory of a night where the woods had tested me and I'd come through. I started the car, the engine rumbling to life, and drove back toward the gravel road, the stream vanishing behind me. Story number 2, Under the Surface. When you grow up in the country, you learn to trust the quiet. It's not the silence. There's the hum of crickets, the ripple of a creek, the occasional hoot of an owl. But it's the kind of quiet that wraps around you, steady and familiar, that changes when you bring someone into it who doesn't belong. Someone who stiffens at every sound and looks over their shoulder like the woods are watching them. That's how it felt the night I took Kevin and Mike out to fish at the old train trestle. Kevin and Mike were city boys, new to the school I'd been going to since September. They didn't know much about life out here, but they tried. Kevin was brash, loud, quick to crack jokes even when they weren't funny. Mike was quieter, more serious. The kind of guy who studied everything like he needed to figure it out. When I mentioned the trestle, a spot I'd fished alone plenty of times, they both jumped at the chance, eager for what they called real country life. We set out just before sundown. The smell of lilacs thick in the air as we cut across the fields. I carried a Coleman lantern in one hand and my bamboo rod slung over my shoulder. Kevin had my old metal tackle box, and Mike carried their snacks. Candy bars, cans of soda, a bag of chips, beef jerky. The air grew colder as we entered the woods, the light turning golden as it flickered through the trees. The trail to the trestle twisted and dipped, roots and rocks waiting to trip you if you weren't paying attention. Kevin stumbled more than once, cursing under his breath. When we finally reached the trestle, the sun had dipped low, and the first stars were pricking through the sky. The old structure loomed above us, its rusted beams coated in creosote, which gave off a sharp, oily smell. The slough stretched below, its surface dark and still, reflecting faint ripples of light from the fading sunset. The current whispered against the trestle supports, slow and deep. "This place is wild," Kevin said, his voice too loud against the quiet. "You ever see anyone else out here?" I shook my head. "Not really. Most people stick to the creek closer to town." Mike crouched at the edge, staring into the water. "How deep is it?" he asked. "Deep," I said. "No one really knows. The slough's been here a long time, as long as the trestle." Kevin made some crack about dinosaur catfish, but his laugh was nervous, and I noticed how he kept close to the lantern. Mike, on the other hand, seemed more intrigued than scared. He kept watching the water, like he was trying to see past the surface, into whatever might be lurking below. We sat up on the edge of the trestle, the lantern casting a warm glow that pooled at our feet and reflected faintly off the water, lighting up the cattails. Kevin kept asking questions about bait, casting, and whether we'd catch anything worth bragging about. I answered out of habit, but my attention drifted to the woods. The quiet had changed. The crickets were faint now, their song muted. Even the breeze seemed to die down, leaving the night still and expectant. The first couple of hours passed without much action. Kevin caught a bluegill the size of his hand and threw it back with exaggerated disgust. Mike snagged his line on something underwater, a stick probably, and I hadn't had so much as a little nibble. It wasn't unusual. The slough could be unpredictable. Some nights it was teeming with life, and others it felt like the water just held its breath. Then, just as I was starting to think we'd have nothing to show for the night, I saw the first ripple. It wasn't much, a faint circle spreading across the water near one of the trestle supports. But it was enough to catch my attention. I leaned forward, squinting at the surface. The ripple was gone before I could pinpoint its source, but something about it felt wrong. "You see that?" I said, glancing at the others. Kevin shrugged. "Probably just a fish." But his voice lacked its usual confidence. Mike said nothing, his eyes fixed on the spot where the ripple had been. The ripples came again, this time closer, and they weren't the lazy disturbances of a fish breaking the surface. They moved with purpose, crossing the slough in slow, deliberate arcs. Once or twice I thought I saw something pale, just beneath the surface. Too big to be a fish, too smooth to be a log. But it was gone before I could be sure. Kevin kept cracking jokes, but they sounded forced. Mike gripped his rod tighter, his knuckles white in the lantern light. The smell of creosote from the trestles seemed heavier now, mixing uneasily with the faint sweetness of lilacs drifting in from somewhere beyond the trees. And then it happened. Mike's rod bent sharply, the line pulling taut with a sound that seemed to echo through the stillness. He jumped, his hands tightening on the handle of the rod as it jerked towards the water. "Let it run," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but the line didn't pull like it should have. There was no thrashing, no fight, just a slow, steady tension, like whatever was on the line started to rise. At first, it looked like the pull of the current, the way water will sometimes tug a line upward before snapping it loose. But this was different. The line rose higher, slow and deliberate, cutting through the water at an angle that didn't make sense. For a moment, it looked like it was reaching, stretching up toward us, as if whatever was beneath the surface wanted us to see it before letting go. "Cut it!" Kevin shouted, panic rising in his voice. "Just cut the line, man!" But before Mike could respond, the tension vanished. The line slackened, whipping back toward the trestle. Mike reeled it in slowly, his hands trembling. The heavy hook was bent straight. We didn't stay much longer after that. The lantern was burning low, and none of us wanted to test the patience of whatever was out there. By the time we reached the edge of the woods, dawn was creeping over the horizon, bathing the fields in pale light. The smell of lilacs grew stronger, lighter now, mingling with the fresh scent of morning dew. We never talked about that night again. Not really. Kevin moved back to the city the next year, and Mike and I drifted apart. But sometimes when I'm out in the quiet of the woods, I think about that line, rising out of the water, the ripples moving with purpose. I think about the slough beneath the trestle, and the way the water seemed to hold its secrets so tightly. I don't know what we hooked that night, but I know I don't want to find out. Some things are better left beneath the surface. Story number 3, the sturgeon. The propane heater hums softly, its warmth feeble against the frozen world outside. I sat alone in my ice shanty, the 5-gallon pail flipped over, serving as my tabletop. On it, I had spread out a deck of cards, dealing myself another round of solitaire to pass the time. The fog had rolled in, heavy and thick, erasing the horizon, and with it the faint blinking of the lighthouse that marked the town. That blinking light was my lifeline, a guide to the ice bridge that would take me safely back to shore. But today, the fog had stolen it away. Lake Winnebago stretched out endlessly around me, silent except for the occasional groan of the ice beneath my boots. It was a sound I had grown used to over the years, part of the lake's language, a reminder of its vast, shifting weight. But I wasn't entirely comfortable. Something about the fog's suffocating presence made the unusual creaks and groans feel more ominous, more personal. I glanced down through the rectangular hole I'd cut in the ice, the edges smooth from where my saw had bitten through. The water below was black, like a portal to another world, Sturgeon spearing was why I was out here. It wasn't just about catching a fish. It was about the challenge, the patience, the rare reward of pulling up something that felt ancient and powerful. But hours had passed, and I hadn't seen a single fish. I flipped another card, muttering to myself about my luck, or lack thereof, when movement caught my eye. At first I thought it was my imagination, a trick of the faint light and the ripples in the water. But as I leaned closer, I saw it clearly, a shadow, massive, slow, drifting just below the surface. My pulse quickened. I sat back, gripping the sides of the bucket for support as I watched the shadow circle. It was a sturgeon, unmistakable with its prehistoric shape. I'd seen plenty of sturgeon before, but this one was different, bigger, more deliberate in its movements. It carried a presence, as if the lake itself had given it authority. I reached for the spear leaning against the wall of my shanty. My movements, slow and deliberate, to not spook the fish. The sturgeon circled back, its shadow growing larger as it approached the ice hole. I held my breath, the spear poised, but I hesitated. Something about the creature felt off. It wasn't just its size. It was the way it moved, as if it were aware of me, aware of the ice shanty, aware even of the fog that had trapped me here. Its movements weren't random. They were purposeful. The cards slid off the pail as I shifted my weight, landing in a scattered heap on the ice floor. I cursed, but my focus stayed on the water. The sturgeon passed beneath the hole again, its tail flicking slightly, stirring the dark water into motion. I tightened my grip on my spear, knuckles white beneath my gloves. And then it stopped. The sturgeon hovered beneath the ice hole, motionless, except for the faint ripple of its gills. Its small, black, beady eyes seemed to stare up at me, meeting my gaze through the inches of frozen water that separated us. I felt my heart pound in my chest, a deep, primal fear I couldn't quite explain. This wasn't just a fish, it was something more. The ice groaned suddenly, snapping me out of my trance. The sound was louder now, deeper, and far more unsettling. I glanced down around the shanty, my body tense, listening for signs of danger. The ice creaked and shifted underfoot, and I felt it, a faint tremble, like an earthquake. The sturgeon darted away, disappearing into the shadows of the lake. I exhaled, suddenly realizing I'd been holding my breath. The ice groaned again, and I stood up, grabbing my spear and my pail. I couldn't stay here, not with the ice making sounds like that. I stepped outside, the wind biting at my face, the fog so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. I turned in circles, my boots slipping slightly on the frozen surface. Panic welled up in my chest. I couldn't see the lighthouse. I couldn't see anything. The cracking sound came again, closer this time, and I forced myself to move, one slow step at a time, searching for any sign of safety. The ice groaned louder, protesting each step I took. I kept my eyes fixed on the horizon, or what should have been the horizon, hoping for the faint blink of light to pierce. And then I saw it, the faintest flicker, barely indistinguishable from the haze, the lighthouse. Relief surged through me, and I quickened my pace, ignoring the sharp sting of the cold air in my lungs. The ice protested with every step, but I didn't stop. The blinking light grew stronger, guiding me toward the ice bridge that would take me back to shore. As I reached the bridge, I paused and turned back, staring at the shanty I'd left behind. The fog had swallowed it whole, erasing it from sight, but the image of the sturgeon remained vivid in my mind, its piercing gaze and deliberate movements haunting me. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, circling beneath the ice, watching, waiting. Story number 4. The Honey Hole. I should have known something was off when I saw the cabin. It wasn't like the other cozy places tucked along the stretch of trout stream I've been fishing all morning. This one was, different. Perched precariously on top of a cliff, it looked less like a summer getaway and more like a fortified compound. The shutters were bolted tight, and an old no trespassing sign dangled crookedly from a pine tree, as if to say, "We mean it, but not enough to fix this thing." Still, the stream called to me, sparkling in the midday sun. A narrow pool spread out at the base of the cliff, the water deep and cool, with just enough ripples to suggest life lurking beneath the surface. It had Honey Hole written all over it. And sure enough, as soon as I cast my first cast, I felt that familiar tug, a trout. Not huge, but feisty enough to give me a good fight. I grinned, already imagining the story I could tell my friends about my keen eye for fishing spots. That's when the first rock hit the water, barely 3 feet from my waders. At first I thought it was a fluke, a chunk of shale tumbling naturally from the cliff above. I craned my neck, squinting into the sunlight filtering through the trees, but I didn't see anything unusual. So I cast again, letting my line drift just beneath the surface. Maybe it was my lucky day. The second rock wasn't a fluke. This one was bigger, flatter, and it smacked the water with a dramatic splat, sending up a geyser of droplets that soaked my left sleeve. I jerked my rod back instinctively, glaring up the cliff. "What the heck?" I yelled, half hoping it was some local kid playing a prank. Silence. Just the wind stirring the leaves and the gentle burble of the stream. My hands tightened on my rod. I wasn't about to leave. I'd already gotten a nibble, and this hole was too good to give up. I cast again, settling into my stance with all the stubborn confidence of a man who refuses to acknowledge he's trespassing. That's when the shouting started. "Get out of my hole!" I froze. The voice wasn't a kid's. It was deep, gravelly, and filled with the kind of unhinged fury usually reserved for reality TV reunion episodes. I peered up at the cliff again, and that's when I saw him. He was a big guy, wide in the shoulders, with a shock of messy gray, greasy hair sticking out from under a camo baseball cap. He leaned over the edge of the cliff, his face red and wild-eyed, holding a rock the size of a cantaloupe. "What part of no trespassing don't you get?" he bellowed, hurling the rock with both hands. I yelped and jumped back as the rock plummeted past me and splashed into the pool, sending my carefully baited hook spinning into the shallows. My heart pounded. This wasn't some cranky old-timer yelling at clouds. This guy was armed and dangerous, with an arm like an angry quarterback. "I didn't see the sign," I called out, which was only partially true. Technically, I had seen the sign, but it was so worn down it might as well have said, "Welcome, fisherman."
Don't lie to me!
He roared, and I swear his mustache twitched with rage. Another rock came flying down. This one glancing off a boulder a few feet upstream before landing harmlessly in the shallows. I considered my options. Running was tempting, but I wasn't sure my waders would let me escape with any dignity. Staying put, however, seemed equally risky, given that the man's aim was improving. Okay, I said, raising my hands like a bank robber caught in the act. I'm leaving. I'm leaving. The hole's all yours. There was a pause, as if he was considering whether to believe me. Then, with a dramatic flourish, he pointed a stubby, thick finger down at me and said,
Don't you forget it! This is private property, and that's my hole.
Noted, I called back, already retreating toward the bank. As I sloshed out of the water, I couldn't help but notice the irony. I'd spent hours that morning trekking upstream, looking for the perfect spot, only to find myself nearly brained by boulders in what might have been a true honey hole. But hey, a good fishing story is worth its weight in rocks, right? Story number 5. The Quarry. The air was still, unnervingly so, as I stood at the edge of the old granite quarry. The water stretched out before me, dark and glassy, reflecting the overcast sky like a black mirror. My fishing gear felt heavier than usual, the weight of it pressing into my shoulder as I hesitated. I'd heard the stories, of course. Everyone in town had. The quarry wasn't just a place. It was a legend, a warning, a graveyard. They said the quarry had claimed more lives than anyone cared to count. Teenagers mostly, daring each other to jump from the jagged cliffs into the icy water below. Most made it out, laughing and shivering. A few didn't. The water was deep, impossibly so, and the granite walls seemed to close in around you, swallowing sound and light. And then there was the legend, the one that kept most people away. They said there was a town at the bottom of the quarry, a ghostly remnant of the past, drowned when the quarry flooded decades ago. Some swore they'd seen rooftops beneath the surface or heard the faint toll of a church bell when the wind was just right. I wasn't one for ghost stories, but as I set up my gear on the narrow strip of rocky shore, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The quarry was silent, unnaturally so. No birds, no rustling leaves. Just the occasional drip of water from granite walls. I cast my line, the plunk of the lure breaking the stillness, and settled onto a flat rock to wait. The hours passed slowly. The water was calm, the surface barely rippling, but I couldn't relax. My eyes kept drifting to the center of the quarry, where the water seemed darker, almost black, like space. I told myself it was just the depth, the way the light played tricks on the surface. But the feeling of unease grew stronger, gnawing at the edges of my mind. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the quarry, I felt a tug on my line. My heart leapt, and I scrambled to reel it in. The line went taut, and for a moment I thought I'd hooked something big. But then it went slack, and I pulled up nothing but an empty hook. I looked at the line. It wasn't frayed or broken. Whatever had been on the other end had let go. I cast again, the lure arcing through the air before disappearing into the water. This time, I kept my eyes on the surface, watching for any signs of movement. The minutes stretched on, and just as I was about to reel it in, I saw it. Faint, but deliberate, moving toward the center of the quarry. My breath caught, and I stood, my boots crunching on the gravel. Then the ripple disappeared, leaving the water eerily still once more. The sun was almost gone now, the sky a deep, bruised purple. I should have packed up and left, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I cast one last time, the lure sinking into the dark water, and waited. The quarry seemed to hold its breath, the silence pressing in around me. And then I saw it. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, a reflection on the water's surface. But as I squinted, I realized it was something beneath the water, faint and indistinct, a shape, angular and unnatural, rising slowly from the depths. My pulse quickened, and I took a step back, my boots slipping on the loose gravel. The shape grew clearer, a roof, slanted and covered in algae, its edges jagged where the granite had crushed it. I stared, frozen, as more shapes emerged, a steeple, a chimney, the skeletal remains of a town, swallowed by the quarry. The water rippled again, and I realized with a jolt that the shapes weren't rising. The water was sinking. The surface seemed to pull away, revealing more of the drowned town, the granite walls glistening with moisture. My line went tight again, and I looked down to see the rod bending, the reel spinning wildly. I grabbed it, my hands trembling, and tried to reel it in. Whatever was on the other end was strong, impossibly so, pulling with a force that nearly yanked the rod from my hands. I dug my heels into the gravel, my heart pounding as I fought to keep my grip. The water churned, and for a moment I thought I saw something break the surface, a hand, pale, skeletal, reaching toward me. I let out a cry and let go of the rod, stumbling backward. The rod disappeared into the water, the ripples spreading outward before fading into stillness. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I grabbed my gear and ran, my breath coming in jagged, ragged gasps as I scrambled the rocky path to the edge of the quarry. I didn't look back until I reached the top, my chest heaving as I turned to face the water below. The quarry was calm, the surface smooth and unbroken. The drowned town was gone, swallowed once more by the depths. But as I stood there, trying to catch my breath, I heard it. A faint, distant sound, carried on the wind. The toll of a bell, deep and mournful, echoing across the water.